Good evening. I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. For those who don't know, Library of America is a nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the many-voiced American literary tradition a vital part of our culture. We're grateful to our partner this evening, the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers. A special welcome to Library of America fellows and members who support our mission. Shirley Jackson brought the American Gothic of Poe, Hawthorne, and Henry James into a modern world recognizably continuous with our own, where the unsettling, the nightmarish, and the psychologically monstrous aren't quite concealed behind the surface of an ordinary suburban street, a New England college campus, an old house in the country, a family, a marriage. Are we in the midst of a Shirley Jackson revival? And if so, what is it about Jackson's work that makes it so alive for readers now? Joining us tonight for a three-way conversation about these and other questions is a key figure in the Jackson resurgence, Ruth Franklin, author of the National Book Critics Circle award-winning biography, Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life. Tonight's spooky pre-Halloween event marks publication of Shirley Jackson, 4 novels of the 1940s and 50s, volume number 330 in the Library of America series, edited by Ruth Franklin. It's available singly or as a boxed set with a companion volume, Novels and Stories, edited by Joyce Carol Oates. Joining Ruth tonight are two very distinguished friends of hers and Library of America's. Francine Prose, distinguished writer in residence at Bard College, is the author of 21 works of fiction, most recently the acclaimed Mr. Monkey, a novel. Her most recent nonfiction work is What to Read and Why. Playwright and screenwriter John Guare has been honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Dramatists Guild. His plays include House of Blue Leaves, 6 Degrees of Separation, and most recently, Nantucket Sleigh Ride for Lincoln Center's Newhouse Theater. Ruth, Francine, and John will converse for about 35-40 minutes, then invite your questions. You can submit a question or comment at any time using the Q&A button on your menu bar. Please let us know where you're viewing from. And now, please welcome Ruth Franklin, Francine Prose, and John Guare.
Thank you, Max. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you, Max, for that introduction. Thank you for having us here. Thank you, John and Francine, for joining me for this conversation about Shirley Jackson, one of my favorite things in the entire world to talk about. And so I'm just going to begin by giving just a little bit of background on Jackson and her work. And I want to say also thank you to all of you. It's wonderful to see that there are so many people here, as it were, even though we can't feel your presence. It's wonderful to know that you are all out there to celebrate Shirley Jackson with us. So Jackson, born in 1916, died in 1965, was one of the essential, I would say, but probably also one of the least appreciated American writers of the 20th century. And it may seem strange to call her the least appreciated because after all, don't we all know The Lottery, one of the most famous, most frequently anthologized short stories in all of American fiction, one that high school and even middle school students in America still almost all read. And yet, even though that story is so famous, it became virtually immediately famous upon its publication in the New Yorker in 1946. I think a lot of Jackson's other work is far less well known. And perhaps especially because of the lottery, which I won't go into detail on it, assuming that probably just about everybody is familiar with its plot, but it's about a barbaric ritual that takes place in a small town that looks like a New England village, but really could be anywhere. Because of the lottery and because of the success of her better known novels, The Haunting of Hill House and We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which are to a greater and lesser extent um, novels of suspense or even horror. She's generally thought of as a writer of literary suspense. And this was in some ways an impression that she played up, a persona that she liked to convey during her lifetime. She often talked about her own personal studies of witchcraft, which is a topic we could discuss more. She liked to tell newspaper reporters and other people who came to interview her that she was casting spells, for instance, to make sure that the Dodgers would win the World Series and other things like that. And it contributed, I think, to a general impression of her maybe as a less serious author. There was a famous line that got repeated so many times. It was actually quite difficult for me to figure out who first said it, that she wrote not with a pen, but a broomstick. And, I think catchy as it is, this kind of mistaken impression of Jackson has kind of pursued her and colored the way so much of her work has been read. And in fact, certainly as we see in this new volume, but really in all of her work, the elements of the occult are always subtle and behind the scenes. Like Max just said a few moments ago, the horror is domestic. It takes place in this, in a very familiar atmosphere that just kind of takes another little twist to make things go wrong. Even in The Haunting of Hill House, which is her most traditional ghost story, it's never actually clear whether the ghosts are real or not. They could just be as a manifestation of one of the main characters' disturbed psyche. So Max compared her to Henry James. I think in many ways, Jackson is one of the absolute deepest, most profound practitioners of horror in the sense that she's always going after the question of what people fear and why they fear it and what the things we fear tell us about what's most essential about us as human beings. But as we see in this book, especially, horror is a very, very small portion of her output. Jackson was the author of 6 finished novels during her lifetime. She actually died with 2 novels in process, dozens and dozens of short stories, and 2 memoirs about her domestic life with her husband and her brood of 4 children. And so I thought we could just start off by talking a little bit about how we each came to Shirley Jackson's work. And I'll say that it's funny, during the process of researching my biography, I encountered many people who have a story or a vivid memory of the first time they read The Lottery. I wonder if that might be true for either of you. But at any rate, I don't actually remember the first time I read The Lottery. I do remember reading The Haunting of Hill House as a teenager, which is still my favorite of Jackson's novels, and just the incredible impression that it made on me. But I think, like so many other people, I'll admit that that was my impression. My own impression of Jackson was as a writer, primarily a writer of suspense. And that was true until 10 years ago when that first Library of America volume, edited by Joyce Carol Oates, came out. And I read that book intending to write about it. And I was just blown away by the breadth of her writing. It includes so many short stories, all about almost all about the lives of girls and women. These office girls who are worried about, who are, isolated, worried that they're getting too old to find a husband, they're getting taken advantage of in different ways, sort of, both spiritual and sexual, by men in their lives. And then this desperate isolation of these suburban housewives. And that the impression of the breadth of those stories, coupled with some of the autobiographical essays that Jackson wrote, which were quoted in that, which were reprinted in that volume, was really what kind of set me on the path to write her biography. I felt that I had to know the life story of this person who was telling the stories of American women in this, incredibly kind of fraught, claustrophobic moment after World War II, before the feminist movement had taken hold. This moment that Betty Friedan was going to describe in The Feminine Mystique, but which hadn't happened yet. The way that she had written that story while living it from the inside herself. And it seemed so resonant both historically and as I saw the contemporary lives of women today. So that's my story of my affinity for Jackson. And I would love to hear from you. Francine, do you want to start? What was it that attracted you to Jackson's work?
Well, I read The Lottery. I think I was probably in high school, early high school, or maybe, and it's kind of the perfect story for a teenager to read. I mean, that is your own secret suspicions as a teenager that everyone around you who seems like a nice person is actually a secret psycho who wants to kill you according to some bizarre ritual, only they don't. And I thought, finally, someone is telling it like it is, so it seemed, I mean, I realized it was a work of fantasy, but as a teenager, it seemed kind of a work of realism or revelation, I guess. And then I kind, like many people, I kind of forgot about Shirley Jackson, or I'd read The Haunting of Hill House and We've Always Lived in the Castle. And I saw the great film version with Julie Harris and so forth. But I had just sort of forgotten about her. And then a wonderful editor, Elder Rotor, who I'd worked with other places, who had gone to a Viking Penguin, asked me if I would write the preface to a new edition of Hangsaman that they were doing. And I read Hangsaman, and it was one of those experiences where I just felt that this book had been written for me. This book had been written for me. I mean, somehow Shirley Jackson knew exactly what I needed, or what I would like, or how things I'd observed about the world that I wanted, that I hadn't seen anywhere before. And then by the time I was reading it, I was also a writer. So I could admire in a completely other way just the technical marvel of it. I mean, what she'd done, and the kind of bravery of all sorts of things she does in the book that I couldn't have noticed if I'd read it when it came out or earlier. So after that, I became just a huge Shirley Jackson fan, and still am.
That's great. And John, what about you? What
Oh,
drew you to Shirley Jackson?
John Guare here on 12th Street in Manhattan. I mean, I always knew the Lottery. I mean, I read it and thought it was the way things are, and still do. But I must say, I don't like ghost stories. I don't like haunted house stories. So I resisted Shirley Jackson because I wasn't. I put her in a slot that said, "Oh, she writes suspense stories, or horror stories, or I didn't know how to approach We Have Always Lived in the Castle. I couldn't tell whether it was a detective story because I knew that Mary Cat had to be, in Agatha Christie fashion, had to be the killer."
Spoiler alert! Spoiler alert!
Spoiler alert. There'll be all spoiler alerts during this. Yes, during this talk. But then Francine called me, and so that was Shirley Jackson was over there. Was just over there in my life. Shirley asked me if I would read Hangsman. She was Francine, who was the best reader I know, asked me. She was teaching, I think, a course on weird books. Is that right?
Strange books.
And she asked me to read it to see what I thought happened at the end. She just wanted to correct what happened at the end. And so I read the book, and I was absolutely blown away by the book. I was by the style of it. But what really scared me was the dissolution of personality that I don't think is particularly belongs to to the female gender. I must say, I feel that my as a writer, I mean, that my identity is splintering at all times. And I was just blown away by the book. And then, so I went on to read her other books. And the Road to the Wall, I just think is one of the finest American novels there is. It's just, it's unlike, what I love about her is her absolute contempt for the human race. Voiced in that book, that there are no redeeming characters in it. And there's even one old lady who is The Road to the Wall to me reminded me of as if Our Town was written by not Thornton Wilder, but by the Marquis de Sade. It had a real its judgment, its relentless judgment of the facade of these California people seemed to me to be truly accurate. And I mean, I think these are the people that would grow into the townspeople in the lottery. And then The Bird's Nest, again, I saw that she was a great writer, not so much of suspense and eeriness as, again, of the utter dissolution of the human personality. I mean, in the first chapter, I thought there were misprints in it because it kept jumping in the conversation. And I realized that the lead character is suddenly not present, that somebody else is there.
Right, there are whole spaces where it seems like lines of dialogue are missing. As if you're hearing like one half of a telephone conversation.
Stylistically, it's absolutely thrilling. Again, spoiler alert. I mean, I realized, I didn't realize until I got to the second chapter that it was going to be about multiple personalities. And at first I said, oh, it's going to be Three Faces of Eve. And I didn't realize that the movie of the Bird's Nest, called Lizzie, came out a few months before Three Faces of Eve, for which Joanne Woodward gave a very vulgar, full out, no holds barred performance of these three separate, one actress playing three different people. Well, what I loved about The Bird's Nest is I couldn't tell how many people were in there. It's like this Fado farce of identities. And it's not run by, it's not manipulated by a brilliantly sage psychoanalyst who is, going to put her together. It's by somebody who doesn't approve of most of some of her identities, and is very inept.
And also who doesn't totally know what he's doing in terms of how to cure her, but thinks he does.
Doesn't know how to deal with it. And the big question at the end, at the end of Three Faces of Eve, for example, Joanne Woodward becomes this 50s housewife. She just becomes, the three personalities become absorbed into one Stepford wife. It seems just one nice person, and at the end of The Bird's Nest, again, I hate to be a spoiler, but I mean, we're not sure which personality has won. It's like a murder mystery. Which personality is going to be killed, because they all loathe each other. And that to me is the fragility of the human psyche. Is I even was wondering, just getting into multiple personalities, asking you as her biographer, I had the feeling that, I mean, I know about her Good Housekeeping pieces that she was collected into Life Among the Savages, which is about her ideal American family up in Vermont. And I was just wondering if that was another one of her identities. It seems that she had all these identities, the Shirley Jackson that could be the adorable Jean Kerr-like writer of fiction, of domestic memoirs, like Life Among the Savages, and her and the writer of the road to the wall. And then I got to realize that house. Then I worked my way back to The Haunting of Hill House, realizing that is her house. That's where she lives. That's where she lives in Bennington. The Sundial is her first haunted house novel. And I realized that is her house, as is The Haunting of Hill House, as is the house, and We've Always Lived in the Castle. So I come to her, I learned through reading about her biographical facts, and by that she's not, cannot be, put in as a mini Stephen King, writer of horror. She is a writer of her own. I don't know who she's like, because her grasp of the fragility of the human identity is so is so striking and so painful that it makes me. I have confess I have not read your biography of Shirley Jackson, which I will buy as soon as I get off this, because I want to find out about what her breakdowns were, why, what. Anyway, it's
yeah, well, I think let's hold on to that question of, who is she like? I think there are a lot of different ways to answer that. But yeah, just to address what you said about, was she herself, did she see herself as having this kind of split personality? I think, yes and no. And, in some ways, certainly readers and critics of her time did have a very hard time just understanding how the same writer could produce these seemingly lighthearted family stories that that ran in all these popular women's magazines, and in fact generated her a lot of readers, a lot of very loyal fans that way, and at the same time could write these incredibly strange books. Francine, I think that's just such in a nutshell, that's what they are. Hangs a Man, probably the strangest, but they all, I think, have sort of something sort of uniquely Shirley Jacksonian strangeness about them, and maybe we could get into sort of what characterizes that. And it was something that, so she fought against that idea that a single writer couldn't speak in many voices, which I'm sure is something that both of you as writers will appreciate. Of course, one can write funny household memoirs and also dark psychological stories about girls and women whose psyches splinter into pieces. At the same time, I think you also can see that you can see her hand even in the lighthearted family memoirs. There often is something just a little bit dark about them, and sometimes what that is the way she portrays her husband, who was Stanley Edgar Hyman. He was a literary critic, quite famous in his time, and a professor at Bennington College. They had I think a uniquely symbiotic marriage that in some ways was supportive of her career and in some ways was very destructive, in that he, as a critic, saw himself from the very beginning as her champion. He was going to be the one who interpreted her work to the world, and in some ways he was. At the same time, he was often unfaithful to her, also from the beginning of their relationship. And it was a dynamic that really undercut her self-confidence and at times even brought her to the edge of nervous breakdown. In fact, she wrote The Bird's Nest, and immediately after finishing that book, descended into a kind of a state of breakdown that lasted for a couple of years. Partially triggered by Stanley, partially I think triggered by how deep that book required her to go into her own head in order to really embody that story, which, by the way, is based on an actual case of multiple personality disorder that she read about in a psychiatrist's case history, but obviously changed just about everything about in order to put it into the book. But I think in a larger way, Jackson was a splintered personality, in the way that I think a lot of women of the late 40s, 50s, early 60s in America virtually had to be, in that, society expected her to play this role of happy housewife and, to raise the children, to do everything she needed to do, to, attend the PTA meetings and to be happy about it. And that simply wasn't who she was. She didn't want to conform to anyone's expectations from the beginning, starting with her mother, who wanted her to be a debutante. You can imagine how that went for her. She wasn't going to play this traditionally feminine role. And that's part of, I think, why she reached for this figure of the witch as a personality, a persona that she felt comfortable inhabiting, and that it was a way of kind of channeling a power where she felt quite powerless in her own life. So she had this, she felt forced into this role as a housewife, while at the same time, she clearly had this tremendous creative force that she had to kind of find a way to allow herself to explore at, in kind of the bits and pieces of time that were left to her amid running the household. So her children, for instance, would describe her, coming into the kitchen and seeing her sitting on a stool, making notes in her notepad, while she was cooking dinner. And she has a number of lectures about writing that she used to give to students, where she talks about just, taking whatever time she had to come up with the stories in her head. That, the writing didn't start and end for her at the typewriter, but it was just a constant state where she was fitting it in among everything else in her life. I think to get back to her work, I asked each of you to choose a little passage, one of your favorite passage from her work to read. Francine, would you like to begin?
Yeah, I mean, speaking of Hangsman and her marriage to Stanley Edgar Hyman, I mean, there's a character in Hangsman, our heroine, Natalie Waite's father, who's so clearly a portrait of Stanley Edgar Hyman. I mean, you don't even need to know that. You just know that she's not making this stuff up, that some of this comes, and it's brutal. I mean, it's just a brutal portrait of the vanity and the pompousness and the fatuousness and the wild egocentrism of the father / husband, and and an awful marriage. I mean, one of the really brave and crazy things about Hangsman is that Natalie grows up in this household. So you meet her father and her mother and her brother in that constellation. And then she goes to college. And I mean, speaking of split personality, Jackson is the best writer about alienation. I mean, she's better because the way she describes her going, and I've read campus novels and even written one and so forth. But when Natalie goes to college, the ferocity of her alienation is so much closer to what I remember of my college experience than anything I'd ever read. I mean, just not going to fit in. But anyway, the bravery of what Jackson does is that it's this kind of, well, Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland sort of filters oddly through the book at strange moments, but she creates this kind of looking glass world, so that the people that Natalie comes to know best, it's a couple who are pretty much exactly like you imagine her mother and father 20 years earlier, before Natalie was born. So, again, the nerve to do that in a novel and the ability to get away with it so that it doesn't seem forced and it doesn't seem mechanical and it doesn't seem sort of tricky is just so brilliant. So this is one of my favorite passages. I mean, many of them are just horrifying, but in a different way than a horror novel. This is Natalie's mother, and both these families, the young couple she meets at college and her own family, blowhard literary guy father and alcoholic faculty wife, cheated upon mother. I mean, that's basically the constellation. And Natalie's had a certain experience dealing with this, and she's grown up around it. So this is her mother's speech. Her mother just drinks and rants at these parties that the father gives. So this is her mother basically talking about the hideousness of her marriage to her father, or if we want to read into it, Stanley Edgar Hyman. Okay. It all starts so nice, Mrs. Wade said, twisting her face into a horrible look of disgust. You think it's going to be so easy. You think it's going to be good. It starts like everything you've ever wanted. You think it's so easy. Everything looks so simple and good. And you know that all of a sudden you found out what no one ever had sense enough to know before, that this is good. And if you manage right, you can do whatever you want to. You keep thinking that while you've got hold of its power just because you feel right in yourself. And everybody always thinks that when they feel right in themselves, then they can start right off fixing the world. I mean, when I used to listen to him talking about what kind of people we were, then I used to believe him. Mother, said Natalie. First they tell you lies, said Mrs. Wade, and they make you believe them. Then they give you a little of what they promise, just a little, enough to keep you thinking you've got your hands on it. Then you find out that you're tricked, just like everyone else, just like everyone. And instead of being different and powerful and giving the orders, you've been tricked just like everyone else. And then you begin to know what happens to everyone and how they all get tricked. Everyone always knows one I, and that's the I they call themselves. And there's no one else can be I to anyone except that one person. And they're all stuck with themselves. And once they find out they've been tricked, then they've been tricked. And maybe the worst of it is that it isn't like anything else. You can't just say, I've been tricked and I'll make the best of it, because you never believe it, because they let you see just enough about the next time to keep you hoping that maybe you're a little bit smarter and a little bit. Mother, Natalie said, Mother, please stop. You're not making sense. I am making sense, Mrs. Wade said. No one ever made sense before. Makes your blood run cold.
But it's also funny, right?
And it's so funny. It's so funny.
And she has such a good ear for dialogue and the pacing of these conversations. And, you know, just the exact right little turn of phrase to kind of twist the knife, right? I think.
And it's a rant. I mean, she does great rants all the way through the book. I mean, characters ranting. It's just, they're fantastically exhilarating.
John, what about you?
Well, I mean, just to echo Francine's, her dialogue, her fantastic formal dialogue, which is so elegant. It would be wonderful to read from The Bird's Nest, but I think there's something in chapter 4 of her first novel, The Road Through the Wall, which sort of sums her, it sort of defines her territory in a way. And it's all about this community that lives on, not her, as she writes, she'll get progressively into the wall, into the big house on the hill. But her stories begin outside the wall, the people who live outside the wall, who don't, and so this is about Pepper Street, which is a model, I guess, of the street that she grew up in Burlingame, California, to be autobiographical about it. But this is just, the prose is so beautiful in this. Just one morning, a severely thoughtful man and a cross old lady in a paneled living room, from the depths of their own private, unowned lives behind the wall, made a decision with the words and paper so necessary for momentous decisions, and never consulted Mr. Desmond or Mr. Ransom Jones or any of the people of Pepper Street, never thought of asking Todd Donnell, who was the most terribly changed by it all. Part of the wall was to come down. A breach was to be made in the northern territory of the world. Barbarian hordes were to be unleashed on Pepper Street. A change was going to come about without anyone's consent. In 10 years, the people now living on Pepper Street could come back and not know the old place. It would be so changed. The plans of the man, whoever he was, were to extend Pepper Street through the estate hidden behind the wall and run it directly across to meet the corresponding street on the other side of the estate. The old lady who owned the estate, who sat in the panel living room, chose to sell the little pocket of land, thus excluded to another man, unknown to the first, for a new apartment building. Thus, instead of the wall running from the gates to the highway, there would be a wall running to Pepper Street, and then along the new street on the estate side to meet the wall which ran down to the other side, and a smaller square than before, and in the end, to cut off the new houses. And eventually a third man would broaden Pepper Street by taking down the locust trees, and a fourth man changed its name to Something Avenue. But this was much later, late enough to astound the people in the new apartment house, who came back in their turn and found it hard to recognize the old neighborhood. Eventually, of course, it was more and more degraded, and the Desmond house became an old home cut up into apartments and then into rooms with the gardens overgrown or built up. But by then the apartment house was out of date and not fashionable, and Pepper Street or Something Avenue had gone down in the world too far to be revisited. At any rate, one morning, Pepper Street was stupefied into submission, as though it had by choice, by the arrival of a tractor, a gang of men in blue work shirts, and the sudden sound of a physical work on the wall. And that's what happens when the walls come down. I just find this so, she has something of the Old Testament. She quotes Ezekiel during this book a number of times, bringing down curses on mankind. And I love this because this was the key for me into Shirley Jackson, is that our lives are controlled by forces of which we have no awareness of, which I feel very much is like us in modern life, that we can do all the protesting and changes, everything we want, but there are changes that affect our lives that we have no control over. That powerlessness, I think, is the heart of her fear, and that's why I wanted to read that section.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And, you know, it segues nicely into the passage I chose, which is from The Sundial. I think maybe the only novel that we haven't talked about at all tonight, which again is one of her novels about a house on a hill. And in fact, if The Road Through the Wall takes place on the street beneath the house, The Sundial maybe is what goes on in that house on the hill. Exactly. Yeah. And so it's the story. It's actually a book I've thought about quite a lot lately because it potentially falls in the genre of dystopian fiction, or, you know, apocalyptic fiction. Because the characters are a family, again, a quite disagreeable family, who become convinced for complicated reasons that the apocalypse is coming. The end of the world is coming, and they're the chosen people, and they need to prepare. They're going to barricade themselves in the house and wait for it all to be over. And then so there's actually, it's probably Jackson's funniest novel, and there's quite a lot of comedy in how these people who are, you know, so poorly equipped to be the last people on earth, you know, the potential bearers of the future of the human race, how they prepare themselves. But I wanted to read a little passage about the way they stock up for the apocalypse, because it's funny, and also because it's one that came to my mind quite often earlier this year, when it felt like we were all stocking up for the apocalypse, as it were. Okay, so this is The Sundial, chapter 10. Twice during the month of June, large trucks had delivered further shipments for Aunt Fanny, which had been stored in the library. Only one wall of books still stood, and because the ashes of books, unlike the ashes of cloth, flesh, or even tea leaves and coffee grounds, are not healthy for growing things, the gardeners had twice emptied the barbecue pit and taken the ashes to the village dump, which was just beyond the cemetery. By the way, they're burning books. They're burning the books from the library so that they have more room to keep all the stuff that they're stockpiling. Most of the property now stored in the library was in cartons, items purchased by Aunt Fanny in quantity and neatly packed. There was a carton of antihistamine preparations, in addition to the carton of first aid kits. There were cartons of plastic overshoes and rubbers in assorted sizes, of instant coffee, of cleansing tissue and sunglasses, right? You can just kind of see all this stuff arriving in boxes from Amazon, as it were. The only thing that's missing is the hand sanitizer. Suntan lotion, salted nuts in cans, paper napkins, soap, both bar and flaked, toilet paper, 4 cartons, 2 complete toolboxes with a keg of nails, since the bags of nails which Robinson Crusoe brought from the ship had proved so comforting. Mindful of Robinson Crusoe, Aunt Fanny had added a grindstone and, with some embarrassment, several shotguns and an assortment of hunting knives. At Miss Ogilvy's suggestion, the library stock also included a small portable cooking stove with several cans of fuel and an entire carton of folders of matches. Mary Jane proposed the citronella for mosquitoes and several remedies for bee stings, sunburn, and snakebite. Essex and Mrs. Halloran added as many cartons of cigarettes as Aunt Fanny would allow them room, and from the cellars of the house, Mrs. Halloran brought up a representative selection of wines, although she confessed that she was puzzled by her own gesture. Foreseeing the day when their cigarettes would run out, Essex bought a pamphlet on the growing of tobacco and thoughtfully laid in a gross of corncob pipes. Arabella suggested needles, thread, pins, hair curlers, deodorants, perfumes, bath salts, and lipsticks. Mrs. Willow, naming herself as the only really practical person in the house, insisted upon blankets, a wheelbarrow, reels of nylon rope, axes, shovels, rakes, and a barometer. It was Gloria's conceit to begin a file of daily newspapers, which she planned to continue until their last publication. The captain supervised the storage of 8 bicycles in the cellar, but voted against the addition of a motorbike, since a motorbike would require gasoline, and he felt that in anticipation of a general Holocaust, the storage of gasoline in the cellar would be unwise. So again, I think you can all see why that passage was happened to be on my mind earlier this year and may well be again. But I think part of what Jackson is suggesting here is that she's poking fun at the Hallorans, of course, but and we're all totally unprepared for the apocalypse, however it may strike us. And stockpiling toilet paper and shotguns and boxes of deodorant is not going to get us there. I see.
Right.
Like it may be time for questions.
Yeah, well, what better place than the apocalypse to break in and
I
go to the
think-
Q&A session. We have people who are from all over the country who have some things they're dying to ask you about. So I've kind of grouped them into a couple of questions. One is about the recent movie and TV version. So let me just ask, might get that on the table right away. Joshua Gunn from Austin, Texas says, I teach Jackson and James here in a doctoral seminar called The Idiom of Haunting. Nothing was more infuriating to me than the Netflix Haunting of Hill House, and I'm curious what you all thought about it. I'm also curious about what you thought of the film Shirley, the biopic Shirley, and that's echoed by several other viewers. Carrie Stewart from Elgin, Illinois wants to know about the Netflix series and also whether you thought that brought a bigger audience to Shirley Jackson. And Michael Saylor from Berkeley, California also wants to know what you think Jackson herself would have thought about the movie Shirley. So we'll group all those questions together and you can talk about how you feel about the various movie adaptations.
Goodness. Okay. That's a lot. Well, okay. The easiest one first. Yes, I think the Netflix adaptation absolutely brought more readers to Shirley Jackson, if only because the title, The Haunting of Hill House, was on bus stops, all over New York City, and I'm sure everywhere else. So, that said, I think that readers who came to The Haunting of Hill House after seeing the Netflix adaptation must have been very confused because the two basically have nothing at all to do with each other. Francine and John, did you watch the Netflix series?
I didn't see The Haunting of Hill House, but I did see Shirley. And well, I'll just say I really hated it. I just hated it. And I hated it because, first of all, I thought, why would you want to make the writer seem crazier than she already was? I mean, she just, she certainly had problems, but she wasn't that insane. I mean, the fact that they left out her children, the fact that she had 4 children who don't appear, I mean, she was very high functioning. She wasn't just some goofy, witchy alcoholic, throwing tarot cards and trying. So it just seemed the most unfair, inaccurate portrait. I mean, also just tangentially, I think one thing that was really couldn't make its way into the film was that when I was, unless you're as old as I am, I don't think you would know, was that in the 60s, certainly in 70s, and the 50s, I would imagine, the occult was much more normalized than it is now. I mean, now it seems really like, but I read tarot cards and cast the I Ching, and I was the daughter of scientists and an intensely, I think, realistic person. So all the things that Shirley Jackson did, I mean, the interest in witchcraft and the tarot cards and so forth, was much more a normal part of the culture than some sign of a psychotic aberration the way it's been portrayed since then. So I just thought it was unfair. I mean, I thought she
that's a
was
great
much more
point.
high functioning than the movie made her out to be.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think, so just to deal with the Haunting of Hill House quickly before we move on to the movie, it sounds like the person who wrote that question had, very strong negative reaction. I would say I enjoyed the show. Once I figured out that it was not the Haunting of Hill House. It was a totally different story that took that as its title and featured the house from The Haunting of Hill House was represented quite well in that show, I thought. But that was really the only character that carried over from the book into the Netflix series. But I think, the director, Mike Flanagan, did a lot of really creative things with, transmuting the novel for TV and kind of in the different ways that he kind of updated the characters and gave them sort of corresponding pathologies or traumas that sort of played off things that happened in the novel without actually representing them. Now I know that there a lot of people objected to the idea that the Mike Flanagan, the director, kind of wrote Shirley Jackson out of the series by presenting this book, The Haunting of Hill House, as actually a book written by one of the characters in the series who happens to be a man. And there's a lot of umbrage taken over that. I can see the issues there. My main problem with it was the ending, which I think was not really faithful to Jackson's.
Tell the ending. Never going to get to it. Spoil the ending for us. What is?
No. I'm not going to spoil the ending, if only because I sort of can't bear to think about it. But I'll just say, imagine The Haunting of Hill House with kind of a Hallmark ending on it, and you'll understand the disconnect between its vision and Shirley Jackson's vision. That said, Jackson during her life made it clear that she couldn't care less what people did when they adapted her stuff. She played no role in the adaptation of either The Bird's Nest, which was turned into the movie Lizzie, or The Haunting of Hill House, which was made into a classic horror film by the director Robert Wise, starring Julie Harris and Claire Bloom. Jackson, she basically said once they bought the rights to it, she wasn't going to pay any attention. And so I'm sure she wouldn't have cared about what Mike Flanagan did with it, except to, that I think there's no doubt that adaptation brought more readers to her. And that's only a good thing.
Well,
as for the movie,
sorry, were you going to go on? Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry for readers who read this and rush to Shirley Jackson. Will they be disappointed by the realities of the greatness of Shirley Jackson?
Well, I don't think an encounter with Shirley Jackson could be disappointing for anybody, because I do think The Haunting of Hill House is just a great, great book. They will probably be confused because it is not at all the same kind of thing. But as for the movie, I think the main issue is that I think there's sort of kind of a confusion because it's called Shirley. It's clearly about Shirley Jackson. And yet the story it tells is completely fictional. There is basically it's not accurate at all to the facts of Shirley Jackson's life. It depicts her supposedly writing the novel Hangs a Man, but none of the events in the film could have possibly happened in real life. It introduces new characters who weren't part of Jackson's life, and new fictional characters. It takes place in a different setting. Jackson actually wrote Hangs a Man while she was living in Westport, Connecticut, not in the family spent just a couple of years living in Westport, and that's where she happened to have written that novel. And as Francine said, the most striking thing about it is that the children are written out of it. And, for me, it's just impossible to imagine a Shirley Jackson without children. They were such a huge part of who she was, and they also were a huge part of her creative life. I think they were a great inspiration for her, and they kind of centered her, and she incorporated them in every aspect of her work. So I would love to know what the decision process, the creative decision behind that one was. I know the novel that the movie is adapted from is, I think, a more accurate depiction of Jackson toward the end of her life. That said, I think Elizabeth Moss is just a dream Shirley Jackson. She's such a wonderful actress, and she really manages to look like Jackson in a way that, it's almost hard. It's hard to imagine before you see it. And, I think she got it just right. They got the clothes just right, because Jackson's often talked about as wearing these kind of frumpy, unstylish clothes, and the mood of the movie it's very beautifully shot. The interiors are very nice and all that. But yeah, the story, as long as you can just kind of turn off the part of your mind that is thinking that this has anything actually to do with Shirley Jackson, then I think it's an enjoyable movie.
This may be a related group of questions because the film and TV versions take certain sexual elements which are very low key in the books and make them more explicit. They make some subtext in the text. There's several people who are interested in that. Angelica Polachek from Austin, Texas says, can you speak more to issues of queerness and sexual trauma in Jackson's life and work? Poppy Livingston from Westport, Connecticut says, I recently read The Haunting of Hill House in an AP Lit class, and the conversation turned to ambiguous sexualities of the women in the book. Was this noted at the time? Does it have any roots in Jackson's life? And then the third related question, Mike Schwartz from South Orange, New Jersey says, many discuss lesbian and feminist subtext in Jackson's fiction. What do you think might have driven Jackson's reticence to address such topics, if you think there was reticence, directly, aside from conventional standards of the time?
Yeah, these are really interesting questions. I know a lot of interesting work has been done and is being done on queerness in Jackson's work. So to start with The Haunting of Hill House, there's ambiguity around, especially around one character, Theodora, who is part of this group of psychic investigators who have moved into Hill House to investigate it, to investigate the supernatural phenomena, so-called supernatural phenomena. And there's also a lesbian, somewhat stronger lesbian subtext in Hangs a Man. Francine, maybe you would want to speak to that, involving Natalie's relationship, such that it is with a character, a female character named Tony. And so one question asked, was this mentioned during Jackson's lifetime? It was. There was an early book of queer literary criticism, the name of which is escaped me right now, but it was called something like Sex Deviant Women in Literature, because that was the term for it used then, did mention Jackson's work, I think specifically Hangs a Man. And there's an unpublished document, maybe a diary entry, maybe a letter, it's not totally clear, in which Jackson talks about having discovered how apparently Stanley brought this book home for her, and the first thing she did was look in the index and discovered to her dismay that her own name was here in this book of sex deviant writers, and kind of fulminated about it. So in terms of her personal life, there's no evidence that Jackson was a lesbian or who had any kind of lesbian experience. It was, quite taboo at the time in a way that I think is maybe even hard for us to remember now, how, extremely forbidden, off the table it was. That said, Jackson and Hyman did have friends who were gay, close friends who were gay men who came to visit them in their house in North Bennington, Vermont, which they often talked about how much consternation their house guests would cause among the neighbors. They had their gay friends visit. They had Ralph Ellison come to visit with his wife, Fanny. They also were close friends of Jackson and Hyman. And one of Jackson's children said to me that he thought Ralph Ellison was probably the only Black person that anybody in North Bennington had ever actually seen before. So, it really was very taboo. Is there a possibility that, Jackson's kind of protesting too much against the idea that her fiction could be read as lesbian, because she did have some kind of latent queer sensibility, queer feelings, queer attraction that she wasn't able to act on because of those taboos? Absolutely, it's definitely possible, and the work, might lead us to read that into it. But there isn't actually any evidence from Jackson's life to suggest it. And to say also that preserving that ambiguity was important to Jackson, because there's an early draft of The Haunting of Hill House in which the character Theodora is explicitly a lesbian. She talks about living with her female partner. And Jackson decided to take that out in the end, either for social political reasons, or simply because she decided she would rather leave it ambiguous. I think ambiguity is important, in just about all of her work, and maybe especially in Hill House. Francine, do you have any thoughts about that question as it relates to Hangs a Man?
Well, yeah, that is the subject of trauma, and specifically sexual trauma. It's very, very basic to Hangs a Man. I mean, everything kind of turns on it. There's an incident that happens that's clearly traumatic and sexual near the beginning of the novel. And what's extraordinary is the way in which it deals with complete repression. So that it happens to Natalie, and she decides, I'm not going to talk about this. I'm not going to think about this. And even though you're deep in her consciousness, because it's a very close third person point of view, you know that it's there, but she won't allow herself to think about it. And then it kind of informs a lot of what happens. So none of these, and there is a kind of lesbian relationship with a character who may or may not be imaginary at the end of the book. So it's very much present. All of that is very much there.
Yeah, and it does seem like this sexual trauma is the kind of the triggering event that causes Natalie's personality to split the way it does in the novel. Yeah, but again, it's only suggested. It's very strongly suggested, but the event itself is a black hole in the novel. We don't actually see it taking place, and no one ever talks about it.
I think we only have time for one more question. The hour went by unbelievably quickly, but there's a lot of people would like guidance from all three of you on what to read in Jackson next. And I'll just say, Laura Harding Lemon from Peoria Heights, Illinois says, I've only read The Lottery, and if you had to suggest a book to start reading, what would you recommend? And there are many questions like that. Edward Hall from Atlanta, Georgia says, many readers know The Lottery and The Haunting of Hill House. Can each panelist name a work deserving of similar recognition? Christopher Whalen of Marshfield, Vermont says, do you have a favorite Shirley Jackson short story? So you can answer any of these. Audrey Czar from Louisville, Colorado says, your favorite lesser known Jackson work. Aaron Illikranen from Duluth, Minnesota, most underrated Jackson work. Patrick Kavanaugh from Ferndale, Michigan, which of Jackson's works did she believe was her masterpiece, if there's an answer to that. So as a final round of answers to the questions, you can take any of those. I mean, what would you recommend to somebody who's only read The Lottery and Haunting of Hill House? Where should they go? Or is there a favorite short story or a most underrated work? Or, is there a work that Jackson herself had a particular relationship to?
Well, Well, for myself, I would take, hello? Yeah, for myself, I would take my cue from Francine and say I would begin with Hangs a Man and then work my way up to The Road Through the Wall, which to me is her masterpiece.
Well, it should be clear I'm a big Hangs a Man fan. So read it. Trust me, you won't be disappointed.
Wonderful.
All right, so I'll put in a vote for the short stories, I guess. It's really hard to pick one or two favorite Jackson short stories. So I'll pick a couple that are all over the map. There's one story called The Flower Garden, a long story in which she treats, again, the subject of race as it comes up in a community, again, very much like North Bennington, Vermont. A community full of narrow-minded people who are intent on snuffing out the creativity and life of anybody who threatens not to conform to the norm. There's also a wonderful story called The Demon Lover. And there's actually a great recording done by Smithsonian Folkways of Jackson reading that story along with The Lottery, which is such a treat if you can get your hands on that. So yeah, The Demon Lover takes a figure from British mythology that Jackson plays with throughout her first collection of stories, which is reproduced in full in this first Library of America volume. A figure called James Harris, who is also known as the Demon Lover, whose modus operandi is to seduce women and then sail away with them on a ship to, well, to hell. And Jackson takes that legend and transposes it to, mid-century New York City, where the James Harris's victim is, again, one of these kind of older young women, meaning she's maybe in her mid to late 20s, unmarried, who falls for this man and believes that he's coming to marry her. And the story kind of unfolds with a really wonderful, delicate tension in terms of, what is actually going to happen to her. And I think, one thing that came up in this conversation that we didn't get into more fully is the question of endings. As we prepare to end here, so many of Jackson's endings are ambiguous. You could read them in just about any way you want. John mentioned thinking that there was a printing error, and that's actually something that readers of The Lottery originally wrote into the New Yorker to complain about. They thought that maybe the last paragraph or the last page of the story had been cut off. But again, I think, she was so ahead of her time in doing that and realizing that things could be left open. You could trust your reader to take it wherever they wanted to go.
Thank you for that perfect ending to this hour. Thanks to all three of you. You've been listening to Ruth Franklin, Francine Prose, and John Guare discuss the spellbinding power and remarkable contemporariness of Shirley Jackson. 4 of her novels from the 1940s and 50s, edited by Ruth Franklin, are published in a new Library of America series volume available on its own or in a 2-volume boxed Jackson collection. I should say I know it's pre-Halloween, but this collection has Christmas and Hanukkah written all over it. I hope you'll join us for forthcoming online events from Library of America on Thursday, November 19, to mark the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. It's a new look at the history of American women's suffrage, a conversation with historian Susan Ware, editor of the just published LOA collection, American Women's Suffrage, Voices from the Long Struggle for the Vote, 1776 to 1965, which will upend a story you may have thought you knew. Details about this and other upcoming LOA live events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about Library of America's Shirley Jackson and women's suffrage editions, and links to purchase those and other volumes of great American writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA live events. Thanks so much again to all 3 of our panelists, and have a wonderful evening.